Hey A-Push kids, welcome back. I'm gonna make two videos for period 8 because it's pretty thick, 1945 to 1980. So this first video is gonna be about foreign policy, kind of what's happening abroad outside the US and the US's relationship to that. And another video about domestic policy, what the US and specifically politicians are thinking about at home, the cultural and social movements, things like that. So this video is going to be about the Cold War specifically, because we know that the key is understanding how the US's role in world affairs is really changing. And specifically what we're talking about here is that after World War II, we have this face-off, right, where we have these two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, democracy, communism, capitalism, nationalization of industry, things like that. So this is really the context of this video. So first, I want to set the scene a little bit. Obviously, we know that after World War I, the U.S. does not join the League of Nations, right? We do not follow President Wilson's advice about sort of creating this League of Nations from his 14-point speech. However, after World War II, after seeing what collective security can do, we create, along with President Roosevelt, along with Winston Churchill, create that Atlantic Charter that they sign that sort of sets off the idea of the United Nations. And so that is key to understanding what is at stake in this, right? Which is this sort of collective security, collective protection. And the Cold War is this, ideological, political, military struggle between these sort of two ideologies, two countries, and who's going to be supreme, who's going to rule. So remember, the first policy is the idea of 1945, 46, 47, this idea of containment, which was an idea from George Kennan, who was a military secretary, I believe he was Secretary of State. But it's this idea of indirect conflict, right? It's the way in which to fight communism is to contain it. And we're going to do that by economically and militarily supporting countries abroad, right? Specifically Western Europe, Southern Europe with the Truman Doctrine and the idea of supporting Turkey and Greece against communism with the $400 million that we read about is asking for Congress to put that money in, which ultimately leads to the Marshall Plan, right, which is this sort of billions of dollars sent to European countries to sort of uphold their democratic and capitalistic systems, because we want them to not only trade with us, but of course be successful in their stemming of the tide of the Iron Curtain of communism coming into Western Europe. Obviously, we see NATO signed this North Atlantic Treaty Organization, sort of a peacetime treaty, which is obviously a big deal. This sense of collective security, again, sort of a continuation in a lot of ways of the United Nations in forming this alliance. We'll also see, of course, with the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union does the same thing with Eastern European countries. We also see, of course, during containment, this push for the CIA kind of supporting regime change abroad, especially against particular governments that may be democratically elected, but may also be of a socialist or communist sort of ideology. So we want to get rid of those, and the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, is a good way of doing that. We're going to talk about some of those regime changes and the ways in which the CIA is involved later. So we remember going from containment, we have the sort of rise of a more militaristic push. We see that with that document we read, NSC 68, the sort of ramping up, building the military, sort of creating this arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States. We have this nuclear weapon buildup, right? We're gonna sort of see who can get the strongest, the fastest, which of course we know kind of leads to the sense of mutually assured destruction. Like, it's going to lead to obviously nuclear war, which we don't want. We also see how this militarism and sort of like suspicion leads to more confrontations, specifically like Bay of Pigs invasion, which the sort of Cuban Missile Crisis, we'll talk about that later. But just the idea of really supporting fighting communism everywhere. And the pickup militarily, we go from the sort of economic, indirect support to actual support. And we see that with direct military action. Also, of course, we know that while these arms race is building up, we also have the space race, right? We have this sort of race around pushing for more funding for science. We have the creation of NASA, the National Defensive Education Act. We have the sort of hope to push to put a man on the moon, as Kennedy says, which eventually we do in 1969. But all of these things were thinking about the supremacy of the United States in context with and against, in opposition to the Soviet Union. Now, the direct military action of the time, I think, is important as we see this sort of pivot from containment from afar to, direct involvement. We have the Korean War, of course, when the North Korean government, led by Kim Il-sung, who was supported by Chinese and Soviet Union communists, where we're supporting the South Vietnam government. North Koreans attack. They come into cross the 38th parallel, which eventually leads to our assisting of South Korea, and eventually sort of pushing them back across that 38th parallel. And so, when this war ends as an armistice in 1953, it's basically like successful, right? So at least in terms of our sort of containment, right? We've contained communism into North Korea. We, of course, have the Vietnam War, this sort of support of South Vietnam against, again, similar with Korea, against the communist North Vietnamese. We have this conflict between the two already, and that ultimately leads to some shots fired in that Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more later, and this expansion of war, where we are actually sending troops and bombing a lot. So, yeah. We also, of course, have some periods that sort of tensions kind of ratchet down a little bit. We have there's a reduction in the arms race in the 50s, sort of this atoms for peace idea that Eisenhower has with Khrushchev. We also have this sort of moment of real sort of possible peace that ultimately leads and ends with the spy plane being shot down, the U-2 plane, which leads to eventually the sort of recognition of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We also see in the 1970s, we see Nixon trying to really exploit the sort of the division between communist China and communist Russia, the Soviet Union. Eventually, Nixon actually goes to China in the early 70s. We also have the SALT Treaty, this idea of limiting nuclear weapons, for both countries. So these are all ways of ratcheting down that tension. We also have at this time like a real struggle between the idea of power, of sort of what are our goals nationally and internationally, and sort of this sort of balance between freedom and order, right? And how do we sort of walk that line? So, of course, we have that military-industrial complex, the farewell speech that Eisenhower gives about this worry of how this new building military and arms race is affecting life in America at home. Again, we have the SALT Treaty, this arms agreement to ratchet down some of the nuclear weapons being built. We also, though, have this sense of disagreement about power and especially the expansion of the executive, right? How powerful is the presidency? We saw that with FDR becoming incredibly powerful during the Great Depression and the New Deal, of course. And so, for example, President Truman fires General Douglas MacArthur because he sort of speaks out against some of his decisions. So he fires him in 1951 during the Korean War. We also, of course, have the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which leads to President Lyndon Johnson, using it as sort of like a blank check from Congress in 1964 to basically, expand the war in Vietnam. And in 1973, we have the War Powers Act, which is Congress trying to rein that in and sort of recognize that it's Congress's job to declare war, not the presidency, sort of as a recrimination against some of the escalation and power grabs by the presidency. Also at home, we know that there is this fear of communism, right? We saw this in the early, or in the late 1910s, and we see that again with McCarthyism, the fear of communism as an influence, as an ideology, that it's sort of amongst everyone, everywhere. This sort of distrust and paranoia, and both parties, Republican and Democrat, really supported, getting the communist influence out of politics, out of society. They just kind of dealt with it in different ways. Some specifics to note, definitely McCarthyism, this idea of the second Red Scare and how Joseph McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin, really ratchets up the tension, again, especially at home, about who's a communist. He says he has this list of communists in the government, which of course was not true. There was no list, or at least it was blank. But we have this sort of creation of this House of Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC, that is basically in charge of listening to people name names about who's a communist and who is not. And we see that gets into almost every industry, specifically the movie industry with the Hollywood 10 and the blacklisting that happens. But sort of throughout the government, we also have the Federal Employee Loyalty Program, which was basically an excuse for the American government to investigate government employees' backgrounds. It was a way, not only that the government was able to sort of get rid of some socialist or communist beliefs, but also it was an excuse to get rid of a lot of LGBTQ plus members of the federal government, specifically gay men who were part of this. It was called actually the Lavender Scare, as part of the Red Scare. That was the 1940s, 1947. We also, as we talked about a lot in class, this idea of decolonization, right? So the Cold War is a part of that in its competition over these new nations. Decolonization is obviously about these colonial empires falling after World War II, specifically France and England, which had large empires, and these nations want freedom. They want to be free and independent, and there's still this sense of who is going to be able to influence them: the Soviet Union and communism, or the United States and democracy. So we see that with our support for Israel, especially in their independence. We also have a war in 1967. There's the Yom Kippur War in 1973. But we are supporting Israel and their democratic leadership in order to fight against some of the more autocratic countries around them. We also help overthrow the elected Iranian leader in 1953 and put in place the Shah, which eventually will bite us in 1979 when the Shah is overthrown in the Iranian Revolution. There's a big crisis in the Suez Canal where basically we have the attempt to nationalize the Suez Canal, which leads to this conflict over the area in Egypt, and ultimately this creates the forming of OPEC, the Organization for the Petroleum Exporting Countries, in order to control some of the power around their oil supply. And we know, of course, we just talked about this, it leads to the oil embargo, right? That because of that support of Israel, we see OPEC pulling away some of their oil production, which leads to sort of the energy crisis of 1973. And again, as we said with the Iranian Revolution in 1979. We also have the Camp David Accords, which is actually Jimmy Carter's a great achievement by Carter. He gets a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel amongst all of this sort of conflict between those two countries in the late 60s and 70s. So definitely a good thing. We all, of course, also know that Latin America is close to us, and we are certainly concerned about communism's influence there. And so we support non-communist regimes, right? They don't have to be necessarily democratic, but they just have to be non-communist. So as we know, the CIA gets involved a lot. The CIA helps overthrow the Guatemalan government in 1954. The Cuban Revolution happens in 1959 with Fidel Castro rising to power. They nationalize Cuban land, and we see both reactions by Eisenhower, who puts this Cuban embargo on Cuba in America. We also see then the attempt by Kennedy to push the Bay of Pigs invasion, this idea that they're going to go back and retake Cuba, which is an epic failure. We also know that that is going to lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis, with this distrust as Cuba is held tighter after the Bay of Pigs, specifically by the Soviets. We also, of course, have the push in the 1970s of Operation Condor, which supports, again, anti-communist governments all over in Chile with Augusto Pinochet, other governments, Argentina, Brazil, that are, again, not communist, but not necessarily democracies. Cool. So that's what I want you to know for period 8. Again, in terms of the sort of scope of the world, the Cold War is the key to really understanding everything, because everything comes through that lens, and how we deal with international relations.